and all of them have the same welcoming feel. Although each one has a different flavor, but I always feel welcome, so thank you for welcoming me. As Pat said, I am just newly hired as the UU Prison Ministry Prison Solidarity Specialist. It's a part-time gig. My full-time gig, I work in reentry, prison reentry for Phalanx Family Services. And what we primarily do is when individuals are released, we help find them training. That training is paid, so they earn $20 an hour while they train. And then once they complete the training that we paid for, then they meet up with our job developer and we try to, connect them with some employment consistent with their training. So I like to call it bulletproof programming, right? If a person is paying for the school, paying you while you go to school, and the other supportive services, then, it's pretty bulletproof. But with UUPMI, what I'm tasked to do is to help with the Pen Pal program and the visiting program. I had the benefit of getting engaged with UU while I was incarcerated. I just came home in January from serving 17 years. And so I am not a member of UU. Actually, I'm a Muslim. And I always share this story, and I don't want to take too much of your time, Ben, but it's fascinating to me because this is what UU is all about from my perspective. Prison is religiously conservative. It is racially segregated. It is extremely homophobic. And I became acquainted with UU through having a conversation with a white gay Buddhist, right? So, improbable conversation, and he was familiar with UU, and so he gave me a UU World magazine, right? And immediately, being a judger, I looked at it and I saw familiar language like minister and church, and so I immediately categorized it in the Christian category and put it on the shelf, and I don't know why he gave me that, right? So he followed back up and asked, did you read it? And I know I made a commitment to read it, and extremely impressed because I could not categorize it. I was intrigued. I couldn't put it in a box. I couldn't label it, right? And so, and it was during the period where there was the publication, I think the community was hyper-focused on white supremacy, right? And so here was this tough, courageous question, of how to make our society better, and these people were tackling it, right? And I just was amazed and impressed, and I became a member of the Pen Pal program. I eventually got 2 Pen Pals who have evolved into family of choice now. We really have a wonderful relationship. And so that was my experience with UU, you know what I mean? And so I'm just happy to have an opportunity to pour into the river in which I had the opportunity to drink from, all right? And so I'm here to listen to Ben as he talks about his piece, and to introduce myself to you guys, all right? And implore you, we'll probably be back out here, but prison ministry makes a difference. And there's a safe way for you to get involved, to connect with other individuals, and it matters. And so, but we'll come on another date for all that. I just want to introduce me. Oh, Pat, I'll let Pat introduce me.
Our speaker today is Ben Austen. He's a writer from Chicago. He's the author of Correction, Parole, Prison, and the Possibility of Change. He is also the author of High Risers, Cabrini Green, and the Fate of American Public Housing. High Risers was longlisted for the Andrew Carnegie Medal of Excellence in Nonfiction, shortlisted for the Goddard Riverside Stephen Russo Book Prize for Social Justice, and named one of the best books of 2018 by Booklist, Mother Jones, and the public libraries of Chicago and St. Louis. A former editor at Harper's Magazine, he is a story consultant on the podcast The City and a senior fellow at the Invisible Institute. His feature writing has appeared in the New York Times Magazine, Wired, GQ, The Best American Travel Writing, and many other publications. He is also the co-host of the podcast, Some of My Best Friends Are. So I will thank you, Ben.
Hey everybody, good morning. Thank you for having me here. Thank you in this beautiful church. Thank you for the introduction. Keith, thank you for being out here and for the work you're doing. And welcome home also. I'll talk for a little bit about my work, and maybe if you have questions, we could just sort of talk about them as well. As Pat mentioned, my first book, I'm the author of this book about parole. It's called Correction. But my previous book is called High Risers, and it's about public housing. It's about a public housing development in Chicago called Cabrini Green. Has everyone heard of Cabrini Green? Okay. You know, what's interesting is all high-rise public housing in Chicago and really across the nation has been torn down. So when I speak to audiences that happen to be a little younger than this one, they've never heard of these developments. I was in a high school in Chicago last week on the former site of Robert Taylor Homes. And no one there knew of these developments. I mean, this is how history works. We have to be reminded of this, to be honest. You know, that for us, for much of our lives, this were the most present things, but for the last 20 years, which, it's been a blip, but for these kids who weren't even born when the buildings were torn down. I wrote about public housing not because I lived in Cabrini Green, but because it was being demolished, and as a journalist, as a Chicagoan, I wanted to think about what that meant. So many people lived in public housing. Where did they go? That we as a nation once invested in this idea that everybody needed a home. And even if it didn't go well, as many people would argue, that's who we were as a country and how far we've come from that. And I also wrote about it because, as those of you who do know about Cabrini Green became more than a place. It really became a kind of abstraction, a kind of symbol and metaphor. This scary place in America, scariest black place in America. And as a citizen, as a journalist, I was interested in that tension between myth and reality. A place that becomes so demonized that's poor, predominantly black, isolated, but then also becomes a kind of hysteria around it. And so what's the myth and reality connection between that? And so to tell stories of real people who lived there, who had real lives amidst violence, amidst poverty, but to think about, where is that tension? And in writing that story, in writing that book, I wrote about a terrible crime that happened at Cabrini Green in 1970. Two police officers on a community relations beat are just walking across a baseball diamond, and they're shot and killed by snipers. They don't even see where the bullets come from. They don't even take their guns out of their holsters. And I wrote about it because it was really the moment that changed Cabrini Green from a real place, and a real place with lots of problems, to the myth. After that moment, it was, an idea, everyone was writing about it, it was sort of shorthand for dangerous places. And I wrote about 2 pages in the book, I wrote about that crime, and one of the people who was convicted of that crime, a 17-year-old in 1970 named Johnny Veal. I wrote about him, I talked about a little bit about his life. I never interviewed him. I've thought about that a lot since. He was a 17-year-old in 1970. It just didn't really cross my mind that he would still be sitting in a cell 50 years later. So the book comes out, and someone reaches out to me and says, hey, I'm a friend of Johnny Veal's. He is still alive. He's still in prison. He's innocent, and he's coming up for parole. All right, so that was a lot to think about. One, why didn't I interview him? And this is, I write about criminal justice issues. The criminal justice system, prisons work in this way where we're not supposed to actually think about people. They're really far away from urban centers. Communication is made difficult. It's hard even to visit. I teach in prisons, and you go a lot of days to go teach, and they send you away because not enough guards, they say, showed up that day to bring the students to the classroom. So it's really difficult to connect with people. And all our language around prisons, too, is about sending away people for life, kicking them out, this kind of disconnection. A kind of myth about the people who were in prison. And I have to admit, I also, I was interested in this question of innocence and how much did that matter. And then I was also like parole. And when I say parole, it's a little confusing for people because I don't mean people getting out on parole, which we confuse on supervision, people who get released by a parole board. And I was like, how much, that seems kind of interesting, but nobody really talks about parole very much. I was like, the Shawshank Redemption, I thought about that film, but it's really this backwater of the criminal justice system and at the back end of the criminal justice system. And so I went and met with Johnny Veal, who now goes by Khalif. I visited him in prison and we talked, and I said that I was interested in telling his story. He was very interested in me telling it because he hoped it would help him get out. He had a parole hearing in 3 years. And so in the meantime, leading up to his parole hearing, I just started going to parole hearings in Illinois. And they're in Springfield, they happen once a month. And the board, to their credit, said, sure, you can come, you can set up microphones in front of us and visit. And just to describe what it's a little like, it's a group of, say, 13 people in a tiny little office. And it just feels like if we just took, a dozen of us and sat in a room and said, now try to make these huge decisions. And what happens is you hear the case of a crime, and because these are people who've been in prison for decades, it's usually a really terrible crime. Almost always murder, some form of grievous violence. And you're presenting these cases, and then the board members deliberate for a little bit and have to make these monumental decisions. Who goes free? Who stays in prison? When does a prison sentence end? And I got to tell you, as a journalist and just a person and a storyteller, it was riveting. It was like every single case felt like it could be a movie. Every single one of them. The stories that you'd have to go back to this crime that happened decades ago, then all these years in prison, and all the things that the board members are debating. And I was just thinking about the very first day I went, which is in 2019. I went to every parole hearing for years. But the first one I went to in February of 2019, I walk in, and it's the tiny room, there's barely enough space behind this office table for a few chairs, and sitting in them are 3 brothers and then 4 members of another family about 7 feet away. And the brothers are connected to somebody who committed a crime, and the people sitting a few feet from them are the relatives of the victim who their brother murdered 40 years earlier. And they're just right there next to each other, experiencing this thing together. And you could think that happens in a courtroom too, but this is so informal. It's just it just feels like this. And they know one another. They're from the same Illinois small town, so their families have been connected for decades. And just to think about what that's like. There was another board member, there was another case where they were trying to decide whether someone should go free, and they couldn't believe how few disciplinary tickets somebody had in prison. So somebody had been in Stateville, which is a prison that just closed, and a history of violence, and the board members kept on saying, 3 tickets over 40 years in Stateville. Just felt like there was so much going on there. Even their own recognition that they were evaluating someone on their good or bad behavior inside a prison, which they knew encouraged people to do their worst. It was just so complicated and interesting. It really felt like a storytelling contest. who could tell a better story about release? A story of a long ago crime, a story of victims, a story of somebody's time in prison and whether they're rehabilitated or remorseful. The state's attorneys from the counties where the crimes would come, and they would talk about, the law. And so all these things were going on. And you think about, in Illinois, it's a little tricky because the person up for parole isn't there. They get to give their story before then and tell it to a board member who presents it for them. But imagining the stakes for the person coming up for parole, the idea that you might be able to tell a story that could lead to your freedom, the idea that you could figure out some words in some fresh new way that might open the prison doors and end your prison sentence. It's just to think of all that going on. So that led me for the next several years to work on this book. And I'll back up for a second and tell you a little bit more about parole and how it works. So coming up for parole before a parole board. So here's the thinking behind parole. Parole was founded about more than 100 years ago in the United States on this idea that prisons are supposed to do more than warehouse and punish. That prisons are also supposed to help people return to society. They're about rehabilitation. And so if you take that logic to think like, how can we know somebody who's convicted of a crime, a bad enough crime that they're going to go to prison, how can we know when they're rehabilitated? And so the logic was that a judge at trial could never know that. They can't tell the future. If I gave you a 30-year sentence, how do I know who you'll be in 15 years, in 10 years? And so let's create a body of people to come back and talk to someone and revisit with them in 10 years and see how they're doing, see if they're rehabilitated, see if they're remorseful, see if they've dealt with whatever problems got them sent to prison in the first place. And it was so logical that it became the law of the land. So parole became every single state, and the federal government adopted a sentencing system where you could get out by coming before a parole board. And it makes sense too, because the truth is, as we all know, that people change, and they get older. And there's actually, whether you're a conservative or a liberal, and you work in the criminal justice system, there's an age distribution of crime. The vast majority of crimes are committed by people in their late teens to mid-20s. After that, crime decreases exponentially. So there's a curve that goes like this and then goes way down. And so you think about, if punishment is also to keep us safe, some people who are in committing crimes and in that high crime area, a shorter sentence or a chance for release addresses that idea that they've changed over time. So that's really sensible. Parole doesn't really work, though. It doesn't live up to this logic and this ideal for a bunch of different reasons. One, in prison, there's not a lot. Rehabilitation is not what's going on. Prisons are actually what's called criminogenic. They create more crime. They demand people be their worst. They're not safe. I mean, we even just heard Keith talk about how segregated they are, how the sort of all the ways that they're problematic. There's also the ways that actual parole, the system failed. People are making these decisions in sometimes a few minutes and trying to make these monumental decisions. And also who's on the board? Do they care? Are they invested in this? It can be so arbitrary and subjective. And I talked about it being a storytelling contest, a parole decision. But the truth is that the story of the crime is always way, way in the lead. That's the thing that's going to dominate all the time. And in the way that you could sort of feel it. Like sitting in these hearings and people would be talking about a crime that occurred in the 1970s. And once it's being told, there's a visceral reaction. It still feels, when you're hearing it, it still feels present tense. If you go to a play or read a book or see a movie, and it's even about something long ago, you have that same kind of emotional reaction. And so what happens in these parole hearings is that reaction happens, and the board members and everyone in the room react in that way to the original crime again and again. They sort of start repeating the work of a sentencing judge, meaning they're not looking at what happened since the crime, which is the only thing that can, that's what changes. The crime is never going to change. And so they're looking at the crime again, and they're thinking about the severity of it, and they're sort of over and over again, and they're sort of this kind of stuck. And when parole boards in Illinois and really everywhere in the country deny release, they usually use some variation of the same language. They say, to parole this person at this time would deprecate the seriousness of the offense and show disrespect for the law. So deprecate the seriousness of the offense, show disrespect for the law. And it's really a kind of catch-22 paradox, because a crime by its very definition disrespects the law. That doesn't ever change. And the seriousness of the offense is not something that's going to change over time either. So what's going on there? This kind of this sense of being stuck. And I'll just sort of say some other bad things about how parole can function. You have board members that, if they're sort of adverse to freeing people, how that can work out, how subjective it could be. One board member told me about her very first hearing that she was, they were thinking about the case of a man who had been in for about 35 years since he was a teenager. He had an amazing record in prison. He actually went by the name Smiley because he just sort of exuded this incredible charm. And he had amazing support on the outside. He was sort of everything you would want to happen to somebody in prison. And a board member presenting the case said, presented all that, and they said, you know what? I'm just not feeling it. And the other board member, this woman who was telling me the story, who was much more an advocate for thinking about second chances, said, hold on a second. And she did it politely. She said, can you tell me more about why you're not feeling it? Because this person seems like someone we should be letting out, and we're kind of wasting money as well as resources by keeping them in there, as well as, these prisons are actually called correction systems. Like, this person seems corrected. And then the first woman said, maybe you're right, okay. I'll support him. That sense of like whimsy, that sense of randomness, that sure doesn't feel like justice. And justice is such an abstract concept anyway. Why do we pick 20 years or 30 years or life, and how it can change? And actually, almost every single case is decided by a prosecutor in a plea deal. So like what we think is justice, but like that way that it could just shift randomly whether that board member spoke up that day. A bunch of the hearings I went to were cases in which a police officer was the victim. And what happens at those cases is, from the county where the crime occurred, police officers come to the hearing. And if I'm the board member sitting up here, there's sort of like one half of the room is filled with police officers. And they all stand up at the beginning of the hearing and they say, I'm here, I'm Officer so-and-so, I'm here to oppose the release of. And they're in uniforms, their guns at their hips, and it's daunting. And you could say that's what they're supposed to do. They're living the creed that a fallen officer is never forgotten. But is that justice, whether those officers show up that day or not? That's going to change the decision. Those are the kind of things that make parole really problematic. And some of you, this might be a surprise for some of you, but parole was abolished in Illinois in 1978. We don't have a parole system in Illinois. And so the cases I was seeing were people who were convicted prior to the law change in 1978. So we don't have parole in this state, and actually about a third of the states no longer have parole. So something like a second chance, which feels part of certainly any religion, but any justice system, any society, we don't have that anymore in our state. And I'll tell you a little more about how that happened. In the 1970s, there was really a powerful time of change and revisiting issues of criminal justice, with big swings on both sides of public sentiment. Not that unlike our last, say, 4 years. Where we've been in this country in the last 4 years, if we think back, prior to 2022, going to 2020, the summer of George Floyd, in the pandemic, the sense of change that was in the air and the way we all spoke about things, that we were revisiting our values and especially around race and privilege and criminal justice. And then where we are now from just 4 years ago is radically different. We've swung very far in a different direction. And I would say starting about 2022 with the midterm elections. But that was also going on in 1970. There were huge prison uprisings. There was great public sentiment in support of people in prison and thinking about change. Even the Nixon administration, and this is going way back, was debating how to close prisons and close all juvenile justice centers. So this was going on in the country then. This moment, this pivotal moment about what's going to happen. And at that moment, people in prison said, you know what? We have all these things we want changed in prison. One of them is we don't want parole anymore. We want to end these kind of sentences because we don't trust them. We don't trust the board members that they'll ever let us out. We actually want a system that just gives sentences fixed amount of time. It's called flat time. I don't want to get a sentence that says in 10 years you can come before a parole board, because if they keep on turning me down, I'm going to stay in there forever. So give me just 15 years and let me know exactly the end date. And so there was this movement among people in prison and their supporters. A group like this back then would have been saying, okay, I'm listening to you, and so we'll go and try to end parole as well. And then at the same time, this huge backlash. This is the beginning of the mass incarceration era as well, a tough on crime era. And so people, conservatives and people who want tougher sentences also said, we're also against parole, but for the opposite reason. We think it's too lenient. We actually think too many people are getting out, even if not that many are getting out. So these powers, these forces converge. You could think like parole is through, on both sides. You're getting this force. And for some of you here might even remember this, if you've been longtime Illinois folk, is that this played out among a couple people who I'll just name. David, not Saxner, from Minnesota. Who came, we had a liberal governor for a while, Dan Walker, and he brings in thank you, Bill. He brings in a reformer named David Fogel, who was running the Minnesota prison system. And the idea that David Fogel is going to change and make sentences shorter and fairer for everybody in prison. It was really a kind of reform that was a criminal justice reform. The governor changes. We get somebody, a tough on crime prosecutor named Big Bill Thompson, and David Fogel gets sidelined, and his ideas of reforming the prison system, and sort of the legislator is really debating what the future of prisons in Illinois at this time. And Bill Thompson proposes something instead of parole, replacing parole, but getting something called Class X felonies, which, grievous crimes, naming them Class X knowingly that that's kind of a way to scare folk, and saying that you have to serve a fixed amount of time no matter what if you're going to go to prison. You can't get out, and we have to guarantee that you're going to stay in prison and serve almost all of your sentence. This idea almost like that the public was being cheated if people were getting out. This is happening all across the country, in almost all states, that we're getting rid of parole or limiting it and getting tougher sentences. And when we get in place of parole, the sort of sense that we might get a shorter sentence is what people were hoping in prison, we get these mandatory minimums. So you have to serve a certain amount of time for a crime. You get something called truth in sentencing, which if you get 30 years, the idea like, oh, you're going to have to serve at least 85% of that time. You can't get out. We get other things like enhancements for a crime, so that if you're convicted of a robbery, the prosecutor could say you also had a gun, and there's also a school or a church within 300 yards, so we can add another 15 years, so sentences go up and up. What happens is, during this tough on crime era without parole, is that prison becomes a more certain fate for people who commit crimes. Before there were other alternatives. Sentences become longer and longer. and there are fewer opportunities for release. Those three things are the recipe for mass incarceration. And mass incarceration is just a real numerical thing among other things. At the start of this era in the 1970s, before we got rid of parole, we had about 5,600 people in prison in Illinois. 5,600. We jump up to almost 50,000. We're now down to about 30,000. That happens everywhere in the country. All across the country, we had 200,000 people in every federal and state prison in the 1970s. We go up to 1.6 million. Never in the history of the country is there anything that shows this. Unprecedented, also compared to other countries around the world. We now lock up about 1 in 5 or 1 in 6 of every incarcerated person in the world, in the United States, one country. It is disgusting. It's so abnormal. It's so just, not normal that it's something that I feel like we should be shouting all the time. Like, we do something that we are not only, we talk about American exceptionalism, we're not only not the best, we're actually the worst. How could that be? How could we be so bad at this? So all of this is to say, this is a lot of the reason why I'm interested in parole. Like these little backwater of the criminal justice system, because one, it tells the entire sweep of the criminal justice system, both on an individual level, for people involved in it, a crime, all that time in prison, and then this decision what to do next, but also a history of our own legal system, our own country, a history of mass incarceration, a history of how we got here. You can see it through parole. And lastly, another big reason of being interested in this, parole inherently asks the biggest question that we should all be asking, and this is what boards are supposed to be wrestling with. Why do we punish? What's the point of prison? And I don't mean that in a way like, what's the point of prison? We all should get rid of them. We should abolish all prisons. I don't mean it in that sense. I mean just really asking, like, well, okay, what do we want to happen in prison? If we send people there, what do we want? Do we want rehabilitation? Do we want punishment? Do we want just a sense of balancing the scales? Do we believe in deterrence? What's going on? And it's so wild that we do something more than anyone else in the world, and we don't really have a clear answer for that. So that question, why do we punish? What's the point of prison? It feels like something we should all be deeply immersed in thinking about, and not thinking about just in sort of the moment when a crime occurs and there's sort of this push for more and more punishment, to think like, okay, really, what do we hope happens? And it's not an easy thing. It's complicated. Because violent crimes for many people, it's the worst thing that ever happens to them, to lose a family member, to suffer. So what do we hope happens after that? And we don't have a clear story. I'll say that another reason I'm interested in parole, and the subtitle of the book is Parole, Prison, and the Possibility of Change, and to think about that possibility, to think about parole as a possibility. The first day that I've talked about, the first day of going to parole hearings in Illinois, there were 7 cases that day. In 6 of them, it was like open and closed, like they just got rejected. But in one of them, the 7th one, the board started debating in this way, and there were all these twists and turns and zigs and zags in the story. I didn't know where it was going to go, and they talked for almost an hour about this case. And in the end, this person got out. It was the one case that day where a prison sentence ended. And there was something that felt almost like magic in this moment, that a long prison sentence could end, and this was a mechanism to do it. And then there's another kind of like magic to parole. Like I said, the people who come up for parole aren't there. But then when you actually meet people out in the world, sort of Keith even talking, your case of like, here you are, like this isn't abstract, this is a real thing. Like here you are contributing to the world. I mean, there's something that feels so powerful about that. You're like, this is, whatever kind of monster version we've been told about people in prison, they're like, we get to meet people and have time with them about how they could contribute. Those are exceptions in the sense of like the release. Parole boards mostly deny, or more often than not. And so when I talk about kind of the power of parole, an exception isn't a rule. It's not like a system of second chances, but it could be. It could be. Even coming here, I noticed that the highway was called the Ronald Reagan Freeway or Tollway. And when Ronald Reagan was governor of California, so this is in the late 60s, California had the biggest prison population in the country at that time. And it was like 27,000, which is kind of a joke now, because they go up to 150,000. But at that point, they had gone up to 27,000. Well, Ronald Reagan is among many things. He's not liberal, as anyone would know, but he's also a fiscal conservative. This is costing the state a ton of money. So he tells the parole board, find me 10,000 people in prison that you can release. Release 10,000 people. And if we think of all the fear-mongering that would go around that today, but there's also a logic to that. It makes me think of like COVID, and when we didn't have enough hospital beds. So who needs a hospital bed? Let's actually make a decision of who is the sickest and who isn't. Same thing with parole. 27,000 people in prison. Who in there we feel like needs to stay in there? Who's actually ready to go home, but they're still serving a sentence? Who's a safe bet? Within a year, they found 10,000 people, and it went down to 17,000. So to think about the possibility of this release mechanism now that we have sevenfold that number of prison is powerful. All right. You guys are, invested in this and sort of this question of like what to do about this. There are movements to bring back parole in Illinois. And it's messy in some ways, but I want to explain it. And one of them is actually Bill Ryan, who's here, has been pushing for a bill for years, an elder parole bill, which is so sort of like a no-brainer. You're 55 years old in prison. You're already old. I told you about this curve of criminal behavior. You've served 25 years. You don't automatically get out, but at least you can have a parole hearing. So the parole board can reassess you and to see whether you're a safe bet to return. That's it. Not a get out of jail free card, but just that simple thing. If you're over 55 and you've served 25 years, and 25 years compared to the rest of the world is longer than anywhere else already. So it's like this isn't, this might get bashed as being lenient, but it's not. And just a chance for a board to consider you. There are a couple of caveats to this. I support this bill, but they're with some caveats, as Bill knows. One of them is that there's another bill in the state that people in prison, a group called Parole Illinois, has also proposed, which would be more widespread. It would be anyone who served 20 years, they would get a chance for a parole hearing. So it doesn't, and it's retroactive, so it's not people who go to prison now, it's everybody who's in prison now. So the 30,000 people, among them, they're only, this is crazy about, the people convicted before 1978, there are only about, 70 of them left. So those other 9,300, 20 more than that, they would have a chance to come before a parole board at some point. And I also support that bill. And there's a sense whether the legislator has stomach for either of them at this point, but to sort of consolidate them, to think about them. The other problem with it is the mechanism that we're asking for to bring back parole, that the parole board is problematic in some of the ways that I said. How arbitrary, how random this decision could be. So the idea that you'd also have to think about how to reform the parole board. You'd have to think about getting people on the board who are committed. I don't mean just committed to letting everybody out, but really actually open to the idea that this is a system of corrections, as the name is. And we have to believe in that, and that we have to look beyond the crime, and we have to think like whether these people are a safe bet to return. As part of my research for this book and just my work, I went to prisons in other countries and in Northern Europe. And there, I went to Finland and Norway, for example. And there the prisons operate in a way where the day you enter prison, everything is situated to try to return you back to useful citizenship. So it doesn't mean that, they're not considering victims and other things, but the idea that everything is supposed to be about returning you to useful citizenship. And so to imagine a system like that would be, it would, save us tons of money, it would keep us more safe, it would be fair, those kinds of things. But we have a lot of difficulty of getting to that. You think about other reforms that would be needed, but also might be generated by having more parole in our state. The prisons themselves need to be focused on rehabilitation. This doesn't really work if the prisons themselves don't actually help people reform and rehabilitate. And then something that Keith's work is obviously centering on is once people do get out, there needs to be systems in place to support them and help them succeed. How, our country is so, backwards in many ways that we set people up to fail once they leave prison. People who've done their time, as we say, and we don't inundate them with services, we take them away, we make it hard to find a job, we make it hard to vote so people don't feel like full citizens. It's hard to find housing. So all these things work against the idea that we want this to succeed. About 1 in 5 of every person entering a state prison today is there not for committing a crime, but for violating their supervision, what we call parole, of being out, which is, think about that. So 20% of the people who are going to prison are not there for committing a crime, but are there because they've gotten out, they were in prison, they got out, and then all the restrictions that are on them, they weren't able to follow all of them. Boy, that really works against the idea. What a waste of money, what a waste of resources, what a waste of humanity. So to think, that's a lot to say, but I think for all the problems that parole has and all the things I saw at parole boards, I feel like it's a worthy cause to invest in pushing people, our legislators, our representatives, to support a bill that would expand it. We also have this huge problem of the climate of fear we're in, and this is always going to be a problem. That it's so easy to push back against reforms and to say, we need to be tough on crime, we're afraid, there's danger, and certainly, we're at the peak moment of right before election, and we're obviously getting this from the Republicans, but even from the Democrats, I think we notice that they're unwilling or feel unable to talk about criminal justice reforms right now for fear of being marked as being soft on crime. And when you think about Illinois, where we are, we have a supermajority of Democrats. The Democrats, whatever they wanted to do in the state legislature, they could. But many Democrats also are worried about what it would mean to be labeled, soft on crime and the idea of, you're putting us in danger kind of thing. Which gets me back to, and this I'll wrap up and ask you if you have any questions, which gets me back to the idea of storytelling. That sense of storytelling, of being afraid of danger, and thinking about storytelling at parole boards, we need better storytelling. We need to talk about this, we need to be connected, we need to not sort of be lost in the realm of myth, we need to sort of connect to reality. And so to keep on having people come up here to talk about this, to think about it in more logical, rational ways. Certainly my book is an attempt to do that on my own part. The thing I didn't say about my book is actually centered around people. I tell the story of 2 men who were in prison for over 50 years, and to just follow their stories. And so then you can't think about them as abstractions, as monsters. You have to think about them in all their complexity. Doesn't mean they have to be, heroes or do-gooders either, but just think about their whole lives. And it's a way to tell a better story, a more honest story. It's a way to build empathy. It's a way to share experiences in a way that it's always important to do. And to give context. I mean, what I just shared with you about parole boards, it feels important that everyone can kind of sit with that a while and try to experience it. So I wrote the book. I actually also have a podcast, an 8-part podcast called The Parole Room, where you can hear what it's like to be at a parole hearing. You could just, because I said we put our recorders in front of them, you could just hear how they deliberate and discuss these things. And I have an episode of This American Life, the radio program, where you also can visit a parole hearing. That's my work, and I'll say, last thing I'll say about it, and then take questions, is that there's a kind of, I work with a sense of idealism that I know is also naive. That if you just tell the story and share this information, that things will change. Like, I think this is right. If I just told you about the number, we used to have 5,600 people in prison, we went up to 50,000, we're now at 30,000, everyone should just be like, yeah, that doesn't make sense, let's change it. Let's do something that's more just and rational and that keeps us safe. That's why I do the work. I also know that that's not how things function, and when I have doubts about it, that can be really frustrating. But the sense for all of us is to keep on telling those stories. And hopefully what I do is one tool among many. Many people tell their own stories much better than I can tell them. And so to keep on sharing those. Thank you. I'd love to hear if you have any questions, please. Please, yeah, go ahead. I'll repeat it. So.
Mine's more of a statement than a question. If you really want to get a front row seat to what happens in the prison system in Illinois, you become a pen pal through the EU Prison Ministry of Illinois. I have two, and it's just a horrendous look at how punitive they are and how they don't work to restore. Kelly Cassidy introduced a bill that went into effect January 1, 2024, that was to give sentence credit back to the beginning of the sentence. Before, I think it just went back to, I can't remember, a short time. Anyway, and it went into effect January 1. And many of the prisons, not all of them, but many of the prisons in Illinois have blatantly refused to do that. They went back to 2010 because they have electronic records. Before that, it's all manual and they don't have the records. And so one of my pen pals has just now gotten out because he worked with the prison project. That was the only way that he got out, even though he had plenty of credit because he had gone to school and he had worked the whole time he was in prison. Anyway, I just want to say that.
Thank you for that. Illinois Prison Project is a wonderful organization that's getting people out. And just again, I mean, you're talking about that sort of tension between myth and reality. And I teach in prisons. I never ask my students what they do, why they're there. But here are these men in middle age who are extraordinary. And I think of, sort of all these wasted resources, but also the need for so many people to visit prison. Every lawyer should have to visit prison to get their license, a group brought in a bunch of Cook County prosecutors into the prison to meet with most of them had never been inside a prison. How's that possible? Like, to not know this end product of the thing that you're doing. Thank you for that. Let me ask the other. Yeah, go ahead, please.
I'd like to get your comments on a couple things you touched on. You talked about what they do in Norway. With your travels through our state and the country, can you comment on the current state of our rehabilitation? Does it differ by prison, by state? That, and then kind of adjacent to that, if you could comment on the fact that our country doesn't really have, we hear that our mental health facilities are our prisons.
Yeah.
If you could kind of comment that up to it, we hear all these numbers, that a lot of people, it's the way we deal with our mental health situation.
Yeah, that's true also. So the question, maybe you all heard that, but that many people in prison, we close most mental health facilities, mental illness facilities. So people who have mental breaks, or they're often sent to jail and they're criminalized, and then that leads to prison sentences. So a large portion of the prison population has mental health issues. And there's a whole category, SMI, of people with severe mental illness filling up prisons. And certainly guards who are paid badly and poorly trained, and really they're called correctional officers, but they're really just kind of police, you know, in the most minimal sense. They're not trained for this at all. They're also not trained for rehabilitation. And your question about, you know, I'll just say one other thing about prisons in other countries, because it can sometimes feel like pie in the sky, but it's also powerful to know that this is a reality, it's possible. But guards there, it's a desirable job because it's well paid, but it also has a lot of training. You have to do 2 years of training in social work and psychology and mental health. And so you're really there as a support for people in prison. And this is so powerful to see. Guards and imprisoned people are actually linked up, and it's almost like a mentor-mentee relationship. And so guards feel like there's value in their jobs because they feel like they've succeeded when their mentees graduate, when they're released. I was there on this tour of these prisons with somebody who was in a prison in California, and he talked about when he got out of prison, and that the guards all said to him as he got out, "See you in a month, MF." Meaning, like, they felt no sense of success, that somebody had worked their way, done their time, and worked their way out of the system. Really briefly, I'll say, yes, it varies prison to prison. Some prisons have better programming. Stateville, which just closed, which was a nightmare in terms of health issues. But because of its proximity to Chicago, had, you know, hundreds of volunteers, including myself, who would go in and teach classes and do other things. Sometimes you get a warden who's very interested, or a chaplain who's interested in this work. That's pretty random. It's not systematic. So yeah, and some states are a little bit better. Montana, and maybe because it's racially more homogenous, but they are, from day one, they're telling people what they need to do to get out, so that it varies state to state. Thank you for that question. Right behind you, yeah.
I'm sorry, I'm new to this, so I'd like to clarify some terms that you use. So there is no probation anymore in Illinois, except for crimes before 1970.
Parole. Probation. Yeah, probation is something else, which is a punishment instead of, yeah.
But if you were released from prison in Illinois currently, what do they call it?
Yeah, we could.
They call it supervision? What do they call
Technically, it's called mandatory supervised release, where not everyone, you can be released and just finish your sentence, but this is where it gets confusing. Colloquially, we call that parole. But it's not released by a parole board. It's really a kind of supervision, you serve a portion of your sentence out in the community. And you're with an ankle monitor, you know, times where you have to get back home, but those people are not released by a parole board. I know that is confusing, and actually the confusion played out last summer where there was this grievous crime where somebody got out of prison and he killed a child. And it was a woman that he had been harassing before. And people on the parole board in Illinois resigned. They were blamed for this. And everywhere in the news said, look at the parole system. He got out on parole. He didn't get out on parole. This was not someone who had committed a crime before 1978. The parole board was supposed to see whether he was supposed to have his sentence revoked, but that confusion played out in a way that has damaged the parole board even more. So it's important, really, to clarify those, but it's a problem too. I think you have just a couple minutes, so last question out there. Thank you.
Yeah, it seems to me that there's a bit of a conflict between the lack of probation and the lack of cash bail. Can you comment on that?
To me, cash bail is much more simple than parole. So cash bail is when somebody is arrested for a crime, but before they're convicted. So a presumption of innocence. And so we created a system, a collateral system, so that you would put down some money and it would help you come back. And we turned that over time into a punitive system where, no matter what, we're going to say, the more serious the crime, the more we're going to add the amount of bail. And really what happened is that people with money, no matter what, were able to get out and not spend any time in jail before their hearing, and that poor people had to stay in prison before their hearing. And whether you're innocent or guilty. So like whether you just, you're going to have a court case. And, if you stay in jail for 6 months, it could be years before your hearing, you're eventually going to plea out to any deal because you've already lost your life and your job and your family and other things. And so it was both economically completely unfair. Wealthy people are sort of back home waiting for their court case. Poor people are still in jail. We also have a system, whether we think people are dangerous who are arrested, we actually can keep them in prison without bail no matter what. So that was kind of to me, that's pretty clear cut. It's just, and that we did that in Illinois during that time after George Floyd in 2020, before the backlash. That bill, the Safety Act, passed in that moment. It was the greatest achievement of any municipality coming out of that George Floyd summer. It happened here in Illinois. And these reforms, which were modest in some extents, but really changed things. And getting rid of cash bail is enormous because it's just a clear justice issues in terms of economics. This other thing is we were so afraid, or like the way the rhetoric about anyone being released, we're in danger, that all of these get conflated in a way that we should be confused. It's nobody's fault. They really are confusing. And yeah, we have to do the separation. So thank you for that question.